There was a gate they forgot to lock. We'll get to it. But first, the bread. Somewhere in the lower city, before the torches went out, a baker's wife had set a loaf to rise. She had kneaded the dough with her bare hands against a cold stone surface. She had covered it with a damp cloth. She expected to bake it by morning. She had no reason to think otherwise. It was, by every measure, an ordinary night, except that it wasn't. 8 hours from now, the city she lived in, the city that had stood for 1,100 years, that had turned back Persians and Avars and Arabs and Bulgars and the armies of the Fourth Crusade, would be gone. She didn't know that. You do. And that gap is the whole story. Let me tell you what May 28th, 1453 actually felt like. Not the strategy, not the troop numbers, not the names of the generals. The air. The sounds. The specific physical sensation of a world ending, while most people inside it were simply trying to get through the night. Because here is what nobody tells you about the fall of Constantinople. The most extraordinary thing about that final night was how ordinary it began. A city of 40,000 souls pressed inside 1,500 years of stone, going through the motions of being alive, baking bread, saying prayers, patching walls, waiting for a fleet that was never coming. By the end of this video, you will know why the city fell, not from the strategic maps, but from the inside. You will stand in the fog with a Genoese mercenary who had not slept in 40 hours. You will kneel on cold marble beside a widow pressing her forehead against a stone column, and you will understand the one mistake that every civilization keeps making, including ours. First, the cold. It shouldn't have been cold. Late May in the Mediterranean is mild, dry, the kind of night where you leave your shutters open and hear the sea. But the spring of 1453 was not a normal spring. 2 years earlier, a volcano had erupted on the island of Kauai, somewhere in the southern Pacific, a name no one in Constantinople knew or would ever know. The eruption had driven millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. The sun weakened. The air wrong. By late May, unseasonable cold had settled into the stones of the city like a second siege. 3 days before, torrential hail had soaked the earth. That night, a dense, bone-heavy fog pooled in the lowest points of the city, gathering thickest in the valley of the Lycus River, the long depression running directly beneath the most vulnerable stretch of the land walls, the Mesoteichion, the place where the walls were lowest, the place they all knew the blow would fall. A man named Giovanni Dementa stood in that fog, 28 years old, Genoese, a mercenary who had crossed the Adriatic for coin and found himself, by the logic of bad luck and slow ships, defending someone else's empire. He had not slept in more than 40 consecutive hours. His eyes were bloodshot. The limestone dust had settled into the creases around them, white against red, making him look older than he was. His last meal, consumed more than 12 hours ago, had been a single piece of pexamet, hard barley bread, twice baked until it was the texture of dry bone. He had soaked it in watered-down, sour red wine to make it possible to chew. His leather boots, soaked through by the rains, had stretched and now rubbed the skin of his heels raw with every step. The chainmail shirt across his shoulders, heavy and damp, had left salt-crusted sores where the links ground against his wet wool tunic. He smelled of wet iron, old sweat, and limestone. He did not notice anymore. The air itself had a taste that night. Not a metaphor, a literal, physical taste. 53 days of continuous bombardment. 69 Ottoman cannons firing 600-kilogram granite balls into limestone walls had pulverized the stone into a fine white dust that hung in the cold air and settled on every surface. Mixed with the sulfurous residue of burned black powder and volcanic particulate drifting at high altitude, the fog tasted of ash and acid. Defenders on the battlements breathed it continuously. The sulfur and limestone dust settled into their respiratory tracts. Every breath left a dry, raw burning in the throat. The cough that followed was painful, persistent. Giovanni Dementa had been coughing for 3 days. He no longer registered it as discomfort. It was simply the sound of being awake. In the gap between the ruined outer wall and the inner fortifications, the air carried a different layer of smell. Freshly cut pine, split timber, damp earth. For the past weeks, since the outer limestone wall had been demolished, sector by sector, by the great bronze cannon the Ottomans called the Basilica, the Genoese commander Giovanni Justiniani Longo had ordered the construction of a makeshift stockade across the gaps. Split pine trunks, old wooden shipping barrels filled with earth, dried vine branches, clay jars packed with soil to absorb the kinetic force of cannonballs. It was not a wall, it was a suggestion of a wall. It held together only through continuous, frantic labor under the cover of darkness. And on the night of May 28th, Dementa was part of that labor. He had spent the last hours hauling heavy, earth-filled barrels to block a 15-foot gap, a gap opened by the Basilica, a cannon so large it required 117 kilograms of black powder to fire a single shot. His arms felt like lead bars. He had muttered this to the man beside him. The man had not answered. He had been asleep standing up, still gripping his shovel. 8 hours. In the religious districts north and east of the walls, a different kind of darkness was filling. The Church of the Holy Apostles, the Cathedral of St. Sophia, the smaller chapels pressed between narrow stone streets, every one of them burning with candles. The bells had been tolling since evening in slow, mournful patterns, not calling people to service, calling them to something older than service. The sound carried across the whole interior of the city, a low bronze reverberation that the damp air turned into something physical, something you felt in your chest rather than heard with your ears. Punctuating the bells, from the direction of the Hagia Sophia, came something harder to describe. A hum. 10,000 voices, Orthodox and Catholic, Greek and Venetian and Genoese, compressed into the greatest church in the Christian world, their prayers rising and layering until the individual words dissolved into a single continuous sound. Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, over and over. The marble floor was cold and wet with condensation and spilled holy water. The beeswax candles caught the gold mosaics of Christ above the altar, flickers of amber light across a 20-foot face. The smell of burning frankincense was so thick it caught in the throat. Under it, the sour smell of fear sweat, wet wool. 10,000 bodies that had not bathed in weeks. Among those 10,000 was a woman named Maria Francis, 42 years old, a widow, 3 children. She was pressing her forehead against a porphyry column near the northern aisle, her fingers tracing the ancient cross carved into the stone. Her hands were trembling. She was not praying for the city. She was praying for her daughter's purity, repeating, very quietly, the same phrase over and over. Let the stones swallow us first. A rumor was moving through the crowd around her, mouth to ear to mouth in the dark, too persistent to be called a rumor, too impossible to be called news. The rumor said, if the Ottomans breach the walls and reach the Forum of Constantine, an angel of God will descend from heaven with a flaming sword. The sword will be given to a poor, simple man sitting at the foot of the column. That man will rise and drive the invaders back, not just out of the city, but all the way across Anatolia to the borders of Persia. Maria had heard this 4 times in the last 2 hours. Each time, she had pressed harder against the column. Outside, in the Flickering district, less than 300 yards from the shadow of the land walls, a stonemason named Theodosios Walls sat in his basement with his wife Irene and their 12-year-old son Michael. They were not packing. There was nothing left to pack. Their few silver coins were already hidden beneath the loose hearthstone. Instead, Irene was quietly sewing extra layers of coarse wool into their clothing, working in the dark, by touch alone, because a lamp would mean light leaking under the door, and light meant they were home, and home meant they could be taken. Theodosius held a small clay oil lamp in both hands. Its flame was extinguished, but the clay was still warm. It smelled of rancid olive oil, cheap, familiar, the smell of every evening of his life in this city. He was holding it the way you hold something when you have nothing else to do with your hands. His son Michael sat against the far wall of the basement, knees pulled up to his chest, not moving. He had not said a word in 2 hours. The last normal memory Theodosios could locate, the last image that felt like it came from a different world, was of Michael 3 months ago in their interior courtyard. Sitting in weak winter sunlight, eating dried figs, laughing at their small domestic goat, chasing it in absurd circles, before the first Ottoman scouts appeared on the hills of Thrace, before the siege. Before all of this, Theodosios kept returning to that image, the dried figs, the goat, the laugh. He didn't know why. Above the rooftops of the Flickering, the sky was wrong. The moon that night was a thin crescent, waned from its fullness 6 nights ago when it had risen blood red and coppery through the volcanic haze, fulfilling an ancient prophecy that the city would fall when the moon gave a sign. The crescent now cast almost no light. It struggled to penetrate the high-altitude sulfurous veil. The horizon to the west, which for the past 48 hours had blazed like a second sunset, 80,000 Ottoman torches, burning so brightly that guards on the walls had read documents by their light, was dark. At exactly 8 o'clock that evening, on a prearranged signal, every torch in the Ottoman encampment had been extinguished simultaneously. Every torch, at once. The transition from blinding, deafening chaos to pitch-black silence had been instantaneous. No warning, no gradual fade, just light. Then, nothing. On the walls, the defenders stood in the sudden dark and listened. What they heard was worse than the noise. A low-frequency rumble carrying through the cold, damp air from the plains beyond the walls. The deep, grinding creak of massive wooden siege engines being rolled forward through wet earth. The metallic clatter of armor. The soft, continuous rustling of tens of thousands of men moving in trained silence into forward positions. The occasional snort of a warhorse. The stray dogs in the lower city, the ones that slept in the abandoned streets of the Lycus Valley, had begun to howl. They had felt it before the men did. The low-frequency vibration of wooden siege towers moving across the plains. The crows and coastal birds, whose circadian rhythms had been broken by the artificial days the Ottoman fires had created for 2 nights running, were now flapping in panicked, erratic circles through the dark sky. Their cries echoed off the stone walls. Something in the air knew. Giovanni Dementa wiped limestone dust from his cracked lips and looked west into the darkness. Before the torches were cut, that horizon had been a sea of fire stretching for miles, a visual testimony to something almost impossible to comprehend. 150,000 men. Now, it was a void. A black wall. He could no longer see what was coming. He could only hear it. He tightened his grip on the wooden palisade post. The timber was rough with limestone grit. It tore at the raw skin of his palms. He kept gripping. The garrison holding this city numbered approximately 8,000 soldiers. 7,000 civilians had also taken up weapons. On the other side of that wall of darkness, 150,000. The relief fleet they had been promised, the Venetian ships, the Crusader army, the swords of the Western Church, was not coming. A reconnaissance ship had confirmed it weeks ago. They had found nothing. No fleet, no sails. An empty sea. The news had arrived, and then it had been not spoken of, the way you do not speak of certain things when speaking of them would make them real. Dementa believed in the fleet. He had to. He had no other plan for the morning. Everyone believed in something that night. Maria believed in the angel with the sword. Theodosios believed in the warmth of the clay lamp. Dementa believed in ships that were not coming. And deep in the ruined breach near the gate of St. Romanus, a massive wooden catapult stood in silence on its tower. Its hemp tension ropes frayed and rotting from the rains, its oak frame splintered and covered in white limestone dust, its iron gears frozen because there was no grease left to lubricate them, its ammunition sling empty because they had dismantled the ancient marble monuments for stones weeks ago, and now those too were gone. The catapult just stood there. Patient, ruined, useless. A monument to the distance between what a thing was built to be and what it had become. The walls had not fallen in 1,100 years. Let that settle. 1,100 years. 40 generations of soldiers had stood on those battlements. Avars in the 7th century, Arab fleets in the 8th, Bulgarian armies in the 9th and 10th, the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and even they had only taken the city by sailing around the walls, not through them. The Theodosian land walls were not a defensive structure. They were a theology, a physical proof that God had placed his hand over this city and said, "Here." Not further. 3 parallel layers of stone running for 5.5 kilometers from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. The outer wall, the inner wall. Between them, a killing ground 60 feet wide. The inner wall alone stood 12 meters high, with towers reaching 18. The stone was limestone, quarried and fitted with a precision that made the joints almost invisible. For 1,000 years, no army that had faced these walls from the outside had passed through them. The people inside knew this. It was the last thing they had left. Then Orban arrived. Nobody inside the walls knew his name on that final night. He was a Hungarian engineer, an artillery specialist, a man who understood with cold mathematical precision, something the Byzantine defenders did not yet fully believe, that the age of stone walls was over. Orban had first approached Constantinople and offered his services to Constantine XI. The emperor could not pay him, so Orban walked across to the other side. Mehmed II paid him 3 times the salary he had asked for and gave him whatever materials he required. What Orban built was not a cannon. It was a proof of concept. A bronze barrel 752 millimeters in diameter, roughly the width of a man's torso. It required 117 kilograms of black powder to fire a single shot. The projectile, a 600-kilogram ball of cut granite. When it fired for the first time, outside the walls of Edirne, women inside the city miscarried from the sound alone. The first time it fired against Constantinople's walls, a crack appeared in the outer curtain that had stood since the 5th century. The crack did not close. It widened. 6 hours, 53 days of continuous bombardment, 69 cannons, with Orban's basilica at the center, had fired into the Mesotikion sector. The outer wall was gone, completely razed to the ground in 3 critical sectors. What remained was not rubble. It was worse than rubble. Pulverized limestone mortar, stone ground to powder. The entire structural matrix of the ancient fortification, reduced to an unstable, shifting debris field. You could not rebuild with this material. You could only pilot. Justiniani had understood this faster than anyone. He had ordered the construction of the stockade, the parabolos, immediately after the first major breach. Split pine trunks, wooden shipping barrels filled with earth from the dry ditch, dried vine branches woven between the timbers, clay jars packed with soil to absorb the kinetic energy of incoming balls. It was not engineering. It was desperation given a physical shape. And on the night of May 28th, it was the only thing standing between the city and 150,000 men. Giovanni Justiniani Longo had not slept either. He was not the kind of man who inspired poetry. He was the kind of man who inspired other men to stay at their posts. Broad-shouldered, 40 years old, a professional soldier from a family of professional soldiers. He had arrived in Constantinople in January with 700 Genoese crossbowmen and a reputation for being the best defensive commander in the Aegean. That reputation had been earned. For 53 days, through continuous bombardment, through food shortages, through the slow arithmetic of men dying and not being replaced, Justiniani had held the Mesotikion. The emperor trusted him entirely. The Greek defenders followed him without question. He was the hinge on which the entire defense turned. Everyone on the walls knew this. Including Justiniani. Including, on that final night, Lucas Notaras. The argument began near the Blachernay Palace, in the hour before the torches went out. A shouting match, in the dark. Between the 2 most powerful men in the city's defense, Justiniani had sent a runner to Notaras with a demand: move the remaining bronze artillery pieces from the harbor walls to the Mesotikion sector. The harbor guns were doing nothing. The great iron chain stretched across the Golden Horn was holding. There was no naval threat tonight. But at the Mesotikion, the breach, the stockade, the place where everyone knew the blow was coming, there were no cannons left. The defenders' gunpowder was exhausted. The sulfur and saltpeter required to manufacture it were entirely gone. Their catapults had no ammunition. Their Cretan archers had burned through their war arrows and were now shooting crude local shafts that could not penetrate Ottoman armor. Justiniani needed those harbor guns. Notaras refused. The harbor remained vulnerable, he said. The Ottoman fleet could still move. If they abandoned the sea walls and the Genoese then retreated by ship, and he said this directly as an accusation, the city would fall from the water while everyone watched the land. The shouting escalated. Both men had their hands on their sword hilts. Constantine XI had to ride between them personally to prevent the confrontation from becoming the thing that killed Constantinople before the Ottomans did. The guns stayed on the harbor walls. The Mesoteikion stockade, pine and earth and vine branches and clay jars, remained alone. 5 hours. The guns were not the only thing that had gone wrong. The failures had been accumulating for years, decades, and on that final night, they compressed into a single visible picture. A city that had spent a century arguing about theology, while its walls slowly became the only thing it had left. In December of 1452, 5 months before the final assault, Constantine had made a desperate gamble. He had formally accepted the Union of Florence, the theological merger of the Orthodox and Catholic churches, subordinating the Orthodox Patriarchate to Rome. In exchange, he expected a crusade, Western armies. Ships, the full military weight of Latin Christianity. What he received was a cardinal, 3 ships, and 200 soldiers. The crusade did not come. But the Union had already done its damage inside the city. The Orthodox population, the civilians, the monks, the priests, responded with something close to civil revolt. The Grand Duke Notaras himself had reportedly said, in the months before the siege, that he would rather see the turban of the Sultan in Constantinople than the tiara of the Pope. Whether he actually said it, or whether it was attributed to him later, almost does not matter. It captured something true about the city. Here is what everyone believed, and what was actually true. Everyone believed the walls were impregnable, that the Theodosian fortifications, having repelled every army for 11 centuries, would repel this one too. The historical reality? The walls had already lost. The advent of large-caliber gunpowder artillery had not weakened them. It had changed their category entirely. The cannon did not damage the walls the way a battering ram damages a door. It pulverized the mortar, turned the stone into powder. The structural matrix that had made the walls function as walls was gone. What was left was a pile of rocks held together by the absence of anything better. Everyone believed a Venetian fleet was coming. Heavy ships. Soldiers. The Latin West finally moving. The historical reality? Western Europe was exhausted and fractured. The 100 Years' War had bled France and England dry. The Great Schism had severed the institutional trust between Rome and Constantinople. The promised fleet was small, delayed, and gridlocked in the Aegean. A Venetian reconnaissance ship had confirmed this weeks ago. The captain had sailed the length of the Aegean and found nothing. No sails, no fleet. An empty sea. He turned around and came back and reported what he had seen. And then, because the information was unsurvivable, it had been not distributed. The defenders in the forward positions, men like Dementa, had not been officially told. They were still waiting for ships that had already decided not to come. The last missed opportunity had passed 6 weeks before. On April 22nd, the Ottoman fleet had done something no one had thought possible. They had picked up their ships and carried them overland. 72 vessels, transported on wheeled cradles, pulled by oxen and thousands of men, over the hills north of the Genoese colony of Galata, and lowered into the Golden Horn behind the Great Iron Chain. In a single night, the harbor, the one flank the defenders had considered safe, was exposed. The Venetian and Genoese naval commanders had seen the opportunity immediately. A pre-dawn fireship attack. Burn the Ottoman vessels before they could establish their pontoon bridge. Restore the Golden Horn. Close the second front. It was the right plan. It required the Venetians and the Genoese to agree on who would pay for it and who would lead the vanguard. They argued for 4 days. By the time the fireships launched, Ottoman spies in the neutral Genoese colony had leaked the plan to Mehmed's staff. The fireships sailed directly into a prepared artillery trap. They were systematically destroyed. The harbor was lost. 4 days of argument. That was the price of the Golden Horn. By the night of May 28th, the city's internal fractures had become structural. The defenders were not a unified force. They were 3 armies sharing a wall. The Greek defenders, under Constantine, fighting for their city, their faith, their civilization. And underneath all of that, a simple animal understanding that there was nowhere to go. The Genoese mercenaries under Justiniani, fighting for their pay and their commander's reputation. Professionals who had sold their expertise and were now too far in to walk away, even if ships were waiting. The Venetian galley crews, fighting with one eye on the harbor chain. Men whose loyalty was to their ships and their republic, not to a city whose name they could not pronounce correctly. 3 groups, 3 command structures, 3 sets of interests, and one man, Constantine XI, spending the last hours of the empire riding between them in the dark, checking morale, plugging gaps, personally holding the line at the Mesothekion when there was no one else left to send. He had kissed his household goodbye at 9 in the evening, formally, as an emperor says goodbye to servants, as a man says goodbye when he does not expect to see the morning. Then he had ridden to the walls. Near the gate of St. Romanus, in the darkness behind the stockade, a Genoese crossbowman reached for a bolt and found his hand shaking. Not from cold. He had run out of cold 3 nights ago. At the start of the siege, his quiver held high-velocity war arrows, steel-tipped, engineered to penetrate plate. Those were gone. What he used now were crude local shafts, poorly balanced, aerodynamically unstable, made from whatever wood had been available. They could not penetrate Ottoman plate armor. They could not penetrate heavy leather. They could slow a man, if you hit him right, in the right place. Sometimes his hands shook. He reached for a shaft anyway. On the plains beyond the walls, invisible in the darkness, audible only as a low, grinding rumble, the Ottoman army was taking its final positions. 3 rings. The outer ring, 50,000 irregular auxiliaries, the Bashi Bazouks, a mixture of Christian vassals from the Balkans, Anatolian conscripts, mercenary adventurers. Their tactical role had been explained to them without euphemism. They were to rush the walls first, absorb the defenders' remaining ammunition, exhaust them physically. Die in sufficient numbers that by the time the real assault came, the men on the walls would have nothing left to throw. Behind them, the regular Anatolian infantry, the Sipahis and Azops, positioned at the artillery batteries. And behind them, surrounding the Sultan's red tent, standing in absolute silence in the dark. 12,000 Janissaries, fresh, unengaged. Still, the finest infantry in the known world, held in reserve, waiting. They had not yet taken a single step toward the walls. In the wet, muddy forward trench, 200 yards from the ruins of the St. Romanus Gate, a young Azap soldier named Tariq bin Yusuf listened to the sounds coming from inside the city. 22 years old, from the rural province of Aydin, a farm boy who had never seen a city this size. He could hear the hammering, the rhythmic, frantic clink of iron mallets on stone, the scrape of shovels, the heavy thud of wooden barrels being dragged into position. Somewhere beyond those walls, somebody was still trying to patch the breach. Tariq had eaten well that evening. Flatbread smeared with mutton fat, dried dates, water from a leather skin. His leather quiver was full. His killage was sharp. He was not afraid of the walls. He viewed them the way you view a dying animal, with cold respect for what they had been and a clear understanding of what they were now. To him, this city was a giant, dying beast that had defied the true faith for 8 centuries. By morning, he intended to be inside it. The Islamic scholars had moved through the camp all day, reciting the Hadith, the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad himself, foretelling the conquest of this city. The sheikh had looked men like Tariq in the eyes and said, "Tonight is the night that was written." Tariq believed this. He had eaten his bread, checked his arrows, and believed it without reservation. 4 hours. Back inside the Mesotachion, Giovanni Dementa had finished hauling the last barrel. He stood with his back against the inner wall, breathing slowly, trying to quiet the raw burn in his throat. He looked down the length of the stockade. Pine timbers, earth, barrel after barrel of packed soil, between him and 150,000 men. He thought about the fleet, the Venetian ships, heavy-hulled, coming around the point into the Golden Horn. He had built the image carefully over the past weeks, adding detail each time he returned to it, the way you tend to something fragile. The sails catching the morning light, the sound of the horns. He had added those horns recently, the specific pitch of them, how the sound would carry over the water. He had added the sound of his own breathing changing when he saw the sails. It was a very detailed image. He had been building it for 6 weeks. He did not know it was a construction. He thought it was a plan. And on the other side of the wooden stockade, in the absolute darkness of the Ottoman forward lines, 12,000 Janissaries stood in silence. Not a voice. Not a cough. Trained into a stillness so complete that the men on the walls could hear their own breathing. The discipline was the message. The silence was the last warning. Nobody read it correctly. The silent dawn. At 4:30 in the morning, the assault stopped. Just stopped. The screaming dropped away. The drumming of feet against the stockade went quiet. The arrows ceased. After 3 hours of continuous, deafening assault, the silence was so sudden and so complete that the defenders did not trust it. They stood at their posts, weapons raised, listening. Nothing. A man near Dementa lowered his crossbow by an inch. Then raised it again. The silence had a texture, too deliberate, too clean to be a retreat. It was the silence of something ending, so that something else could begin. They had beaten back the first wave. The Bashi bazooks, 50,000 irregular troops, had thrown themselves against the stockade for 3 hours and accomplished nothing except the expenditure of whatever arrows and stones the defenders had left.
Which was the point. That had always been the point. 40 minutes. The second wave came from the east. The regular Anatolian infantry, the Sipais and Azaps, better equipped, better trained, moving with the disciplined coordination of men who had been told exactly where to go and what to do when they got there. They came at the Mesotikian sector, exactly where everyone had known the blow would land. Constantine XI was there, personally, on foot, in the breach. An emperor of Rome, standing in a gap in a pine and earth palisade at 4 a.m, sword in hand, holding a line that his empire could not replace. The accounts describe him moving continuously along the inner terrace, checking, repositioning, pulling exhausted men back from the forward edge, and finding men slightly less exhausted to replace them. Running on something that was no longer physical energy, something older. The particular fuel that burns in a person when they have nothing left but the refusal to stop. The second wave broke against the stockade. The Genoese crossbowmen held. Dementa, hands still shaking, crude shafts still flying badly, held. The Anatolian infantry retreated. For a moment, a very brief moment, something moved through the men on the walls. Not hope exactly. Its ghost. The memory of what hope felt like. Then Mehmed released the Janissaries. 12,000 men. Fresh, unengaged, silent. They had stood in absolute stillness for 6 hours, while 2 waves of infantry broke against the walls ahead of them. They wore distinctive white felt caps. They moved in perfect formation, 12 abreast, at a walking pace. Not running, walking. The discipline was the weapon. As they advanced, they did not scream. They chanted, a single rhythmic phrase, the same phrase at the same tempo from 12,000 throats simultaneously. The sound carried over the walls and into the city like something tidal. The defenders felt it in their bodies before they processed it in their minds. Not the quantity of the threat, the quality. At 5:30 in the morning, a crossbow bolt, or a piece of artillery shrapnel, the sources disagree, found Giovanni Justiniani Longo. It entered his chest, or his arm. The sources disagree on this too. What the sources agree on: it went deep. It penetrated the cavity. It was not a surface wound. Justiniani's men saw him go down. They saw the blood. And they made a decision that was both completely rational and completely catastrophic. They began moving him toward the harbor, away from the stockade, toward the Genoese ships. Giovanni Dementa was 20 feet to the left when it happened. He did not see Justiniani fall. He heard it. The change in the sound of the men around him. The specific quality of a crowd that has received information and not yet decided what to do with it. He turned. He saw the Genoese soldiers moving, not toward the breach. Away from it, he saw the gap opening in the line where Justiniani's men had been standing. He saw, in the same moment, the first white felt cap appear at the top of the stockade. A janissary. One man. Hauling himself over the pine timber with both hands. Then a second.
then several at once, moving with a trained, mechanical efficiency that looked almost calm. Dementa heard from behind him the sound of the inner gate being locked, the crash of the heavy bolt sliding into its iron bracket. Trapping the men in the peribolos, the narrow killing ground between the outer stockade and the inner wall, on the wrong side of the only exit. He stood between the white turbans climbing over the wood in front of him and the locked stone wall behind him. He looked left, he looked right. The first Ottoman standard was rising on the tower to the north, a slow, deliberate unfurling against the pale gray sky. In that 5-second window, with the standard still rising and the Janissaries still climbing, and the inner gate still reverberating from the force of its own closing, Giovanni Dementa understood. No fleet was coming. No sails, no horns, no morning light catching white canvas. The image he had built over 6 weeks, detail by careful detail, dissolved completely. Not gradually, at once. The way a thing dissolves when you finally stop needing it to be real. The city was lost. He had known this for weeks. His body was only now catching up. Now, the gate. Somewhere along the walls, in the chaos, in the dark, in the frantic scramble of sleep-deprived men working without light or command, a small door had been left unbolted. The Kerkoporta, a low, vaulted postern gate in the Blackernai sector. Low enough that a man had to duck to pass through, barely wide enough for 2 men abreast. A sally port used for centuries to launch minor counter-raids, to inspect the outer ditch, to slip a scout through the walls in darkness. Earlier in the night, a small detachment of defenders had used it to probe the Ottoman trench lines. In the chaos of their retreat under artillery fire, exhausted beyond the point where the mind holds on to small details, they had not secured it behind them. Not sabotage, not treason. Exhaustion. The most ordinary of catastrophes. A small group of Ottoman bashi-bazouks, advancing along the base of the wall, found the door. Unbolted. Open. They slipped through. They climbed the tower. They raised the Ottoman banner. The banner was visible from inside the city before the walls were formally breached. Defenders in the northern sectors saw it and understood what it meant. The panic did not build gradually. It arrived whole. Stations were abandoned. Men who had held their positions through 3 waves of assault, through hours of darkness and cold, and the particular sustained terror of waiting for something you know is coming, broke at the sight of a flag on a tower. Not because the flag meant the city had fallen, because it meant the story they had been telling themselves, we are holding, we might hold, there is still a chance, was over. The flag was not a military development. It was a narrative collapse. And narrative collapse, in a defense already running on the thinnest possible fuel, was enough. Constantine XI saw the banner. He was still in the breach. Still on foot, still holding. George Francis, his closest friend, the man who would survive and write it all down years later in exile, was not present at the exact moment. But the accounts converge on what happened next. Constantine removed his imperial insignia. The gold, the marks of 1,000 years of Roman succession. He set them aside. And then the last emperor of the Romans charged into the advancing Janissaries. On foot, into the Janissaries. He was not attempting a heroic last stand. He was doing the only thing left to a man who had run out of everything else and refused to be taken alive. He was last seen near the gate of St. Romanus, fighting on foot, surrounded. After that, nothing. His body was never definitively identified. The man who had been the direct successor of Constantine the Great, whose empire had begun under a Constantine whose mother was Helena, and ended under a Constantine whose mother was Helena, the prophecy completing itself in the exact way prophecies do, which is to say, terribly, disappeared into the crowd of the final assault and was not seen again. Gone. By 6 a.m, it was over.
The Ottoman troops entered the city through the breach in the Mesotachion, and through the Kerkoporta, and through gaps in the walls that the bombardment had made and that exhaustion had failed to plug. The great bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia were forced, the doors that had stood for 900 years. The crowd inside, 10,000 people, some still on their knees, some still holding candles, heard the doors give way. The sound is not described precisely in any contemporary account. It didn't need to be. Everyone inside knew what it was. The candles guttered in the sudden draft. Some went out. In the Hagia Sophia, for the first time in 900 years, the interior went partially dark.
Maria Frances did not run. She pulled her daughter close. She pressed Zoe's face against her shoulder. She put her hand over her daughter's eyes. She stood against the porphyry column. The same column, the same cross carved into the stone. She kept her hand over her daughter's eyes. She waited. In the basement of the Blaherne house, Theodosios heard the doors. Even from 300 yards away, through stone walls and a basement ceiling, the sound carried. He reached out in the dark and found his wife's hand. He found his son's shoulder. He pulled them both close. He held the clay lamp against his chest with his free hand. Cold now, completely cold. The warmth was gone, but he held it anyway. Niccolo Barbaro, the Venetian physician who had kept a daily journal of the entire 53-day siege, wrote in his entry for May 29th, "The blood flowed in the city like rainwater after a sudden storm." He wrote, "The bodies of the dead were thrown into the Sea of Marmara and the Golden Horn, floating like melons upon the water." He was writing from a ship. He had made it to the harbor. He was watching from the water as a city he had lived in for weeks became something else entirely. He kept writing. Because a physician keeps records. Because a witness has obligations. Because some part of him understood, even on that morning, that the only thing he could give this city now was accuracy. So he wrote. Here is what actually ended on the morning of May 29th, 1453. Not just a city, the last continuous institutional thread connecting the living world to the Roman Empire. The empire that had organized European civilization for 1,200 years, that had carried the Greek philosophical tradition through the Dark Ages, that had kept the texts of Aristotle and Plato and Euclid alive in its libraries while Western Europe forgot how to read them. That thread, on that morning, was cut. 1,100 years of unbroken succession. 44 emperors in a direct line back to Constantine the Great. Gone before the sun was fully up. The last candle in the Hagia Sophia burned down to its base that morning. Nobody replaced it. There was no point. Now, here is the part that should keep you awake. Not because it is ancient, because it is not. Constantinople did not fall because the Ottoman army was unstoppable. The Ottoman army was very good. But this city had repelled armies just as good, larger, more determined, for 1,100 years. Constantinople fell because the people inside it had confused the symbol of their safety with actual safety. The walls had held for 1,000 years. Therefore, the walls would hold. The logic was impeccable. The conclusion was wrong, because the walls that had held for 1,000 years had been built for a world in which large-caliber gunpowder artillery did not exist. The moment Orban's cannon fired its first shot, the Theodosian Walls stopped being fortifications and started being targets. But the people inside them could not update the story. The walls meant safety. The walls had always meant safety. The walls would mean safety now. History keeps running the same experiment. France built the Maginot Line in the 1930s, the most expensive, technically advanced concrete fortification in human history, designed around the exact tactical assumptions of the First World War. The German panzer divisions went around it. Through the Ardennes, which everyone had agreed was impassable. Nokia owned the global mobile phone market in 2007, with hardware no competitor could match. Apple shipped a phone with no physical buttons and a piece of software called iOS. Nokia's leadership looked at it and saw a minor disruption to an established market. They were running the same logic as the men on those walls. The walls have always held. The walls will hold now. They did not hold. 11 years before the final assault, a Hungarian engineer offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor. The emperor could not pay him. The engineer walked across to the other side. One conversation, one decision about funding, and the walls that had stood for 1,100 years had at that moment already fallen. They just didn't know it yet. George Francis survived. He escaped on a Venetian ship and spent the rest of his life writing down what he had seen. Years later, in exile, he wrote a sentence that has stayed with every historian who has read it since. He wrote, "We destroyed ourselves through our pride and our refusal to trust our brothers." Not the cannons, not the Janissaries, not the unlocked gate. Ourselves, through pride. Through the refusal to trust, through the particular human capacity to look at a wall that has held for 1,000 years and decide that this fact alone is sufficient preparation for what is coming. It wasn't. It never is. The bread in the lower city was never baked. The baker's wife, who had set the dough to rise before the torches went out, she did not make it to morning. The dough rose in the dark, alone, and then collapsed. Nobody was there to see it. The house was silent by then. Everything was silent. The city that had been the loudest place in the medieval world, the bells, the prayers, the market cries, the hammers on the walls, had gone quiet in the space of a few hours. A silence that felt, to those who survived it, like the world holding its breath, waiting to understand what it had just become. The bread, the lamp, the cross in the stone, the image of ships that were never coming. These are not footnotes to the fall of Constantinople. These are the fall of Constantinople. The rest, the cannons, the numbers, the name of the gate, the specific hour, that is the skeleton. The bread is the body. The lamp is the body. The hand over a daughter's eyes. The father holding his son's gaze in the dark. This is where history actually lives. Not in the dates, in the last normal moment before everything changed. Next week, a city that had survived earthquakes, plagues, and 3 centuries of siege. A city whose walls had never been touched. Brought down, in the end, by something nobody saw coming. Something that arrived not with an army, but with a smell in the water. The last night of Carthage.